Hi, this is Ulrich Hoinkes from Kiel University, Germany. If you have a moment, I'd like to invite you to join me for a 15 minutes talk about the way we feel anxieties in many ways in our time. I'm the initiator of the Anxiety Culture Research Project, which I founded a few years ago together with my colleague John Allegranti from Teachers College at Columbia University. I gave this paper at the panel on anxiety, chaired by John at the 27th Conference of Europeanists of CS this year, 2021, and I'm happy to share it with you as well. Its title is The Modern Form of Fear, Focused but Not Factual. In questions of fear, theology was the leading discipline in European thought until the end of the 19th century. Even before psychoanalysis appeared on the scene in the 20th century and gave fear a completely new dimension of scientific consideration, it was the theologian Søren Kierkegaard who, in his treatise The Concept of Anxiety of 1844, proposed an interpretation of fear that further developed the traditional ideas of Christianity and made possible new ways of a philosophical anthropological classification of fear. In doing so, anxiety is placed in relation to the fundamentally given human freedom, and a causal dependence between the two is postulated. Man is fearful because his path is not predestined, and thus all essential decisions are demanded of him. This fundamental fear of man is qualitatively different from the fear of something concrete, such as a particular threat or danger. It is an indeterminate, diffuse fear that can be constructively directed through reflection and through faith-based closeness to God. It is well known that philosophical existentialism was largely inspired by Kierkegaard and developed into a formative paradigm of human philosophical self-determination in the 20th century. In this context, both the basic element of a diffuse existential anxiety and the close interweaving of anxiety and freedom continued to prove to be the decisive parameters of anthropology and humanism. In the 21st century, at the latest, however, we have witnessed a profound shift in the way we think, interpret, and act about fears and their impact in the public sphere. As early as in the 1980s, public discourse took a new turn with the perception of an ethic and obligation to act in the face of dangers and threats that directly affect each individual as a member of postmodern society. The philosophical stance on this was now determined by a certain pragmatism, which ideologically referred to the foundations of post-war society with different emphasis: human rights and constitutional rights, democracy, political stability, capitalist economy, and ecological consequences were important signposts and admonishers here. Fear in its relevant dimension shifted away from the individual to a socio-psychological view and was presented as a phenomenon to be fundamentally overcome. The yardstick of this overcoming of fears was the calculated risk, which appears to be unavoidable, but can be contained according to rational standards and thus in principle kept free of danger. Ulrich Beck's Risk Society is a sociologist's comprehensive and formative attempt to ground and sustain this public belief in risk control. In the theory of the risk society, fear is at best a warning signal that calls reason into action as a pragmatic decision maker, and thus is itself not permanent. If one reads Ulrich Beck's last book, posthumously published in 2015 under the title The Metamorphosis of the World, one becomes aware of the fact that even Beck recognized that parameters of the risk societies no longer apply and that we have to adapt to a completely changed world whose development forecasts now ultimately do reveal concrete dangers and will force us to make various changes of direction in our behavior. However, Beck's faith in reason did not yet allow him to recognize, even in his last work, the increasing and changing significance of fears in our contemporary world. In the public discourses of the present, on the other hand, critical and reflective voices are multiplying worldwide that deal with the significance of fear in our present. Representative of many more publications, only 3 may be mentioned here. Heinz Bude, The Society of Fear from 2014, English translation 2017. Martha Nussbaum, The Monarchy of Fear 2018. And Frank Bies, German Angst, Fear and Democracy in the Federal Republic of Germany 2020. But what form of fear is at stake in our contemporary postmodern society? The answer to this question is not simple and constitutes the fundamental task of a large-scale interdisciplinary research project that we have been developing since 2015 in cooperation at Kiel University and Columbia University, together with a steadily growing international research network that includes CS. In the context of this anxiety culture project, some characteristics of the anxieties that currently define us are emerging with the perception of the major problem areas in our world today. These characteristics are the following. The anxieties of our time are triggered by a loss of confidence in the future, which in Western industrial societies relates to triple concern: securing personal well-being, maintaining socioeconomic prosperity, and the increasing destruction of our natural environment. The fear focus on definable problem areas, which can be marked with buzzwords such as terrorism, political instability, artificial intelligence, migration, climate change, public health, etc. These problem areas cannot be viewed in isolation from one another, but rather reveal their complex interconnectedness. Fears are often expressed in society as general moods, Stimmungen, as Heinz Bude says. This means as effective patterns of action or emotional forms of evaluation, the starting point of which is usually an experience of crisis in which confidence in overcoming or solving this crisis is dwindling in public discourse. Fears are focused within the respective prevailing public crisis discourses. That means their naming and recognition are an essential part of the discourse itself and significantly shape it, for example, as fear of Islam, fear of migrants, fear of environmental destruction, fear of viral epidemics, etc. The omnipresence of fears and the interdependence of their location in different problem areas make it largely impossible to concretize the respective focuses as real and avertible dangers and threats. Many fear scenarios are thus the focus of current debates, without the factual verification being the standard of judgment. This is where the social experience of fear meets a bizarre development of our time, which has been called a post-factual mediated society. In my view, the now clearly recognized and widely exemplified phenomenon of a world explained on the basis of truth, of post-truth, has not yet been convincingly analyzed. The bulk of reason-oriented people are content with not understanding the other part of society and dismiss post-truth-led people as poor misfits. Nevertheless, they now constitute a relevant voter potential for political parties. It is therefore far from sufficient to dismiss the increased and also politically relevant emergence of irrational ways of thinking and interpreting as aberrations of individuals or manipulated groups. Rather, it seems to find its justification in the new form of fear, which we can call a focused but not factually mediated fear within the anxiety culture of our time. This phenomenon is difficult to discern from the vantage point of public discourse, yet political leaders, with some significant exceptions, I admit, and many dedicated public intellectuals, strive to uphold the flag of reason in addressing our most pressing problem areas and future issues. For example, there are plenty of reasonable public voices against migrant phobia, against downplaying climate change impacts, or against opposing protective measures against viral contagions. But the truth and facts presented here no longer reach many people in terms of their fundamentally fear-driven behavior. Thus, we all constantly contradict our own fears with our actions. Everyone knows examples of this from his or her private sphere, such as the topics of environmental protection, health protection, or data protection. At other times, our fears take precedence over the facts we know. For example, in the case of racist behavior or the adoption of prejudices against religions, attitudes that we frighteningly often detect even among our friends. It is therefore a socially highly relevant task of the humanities to analyze more closely the new form of fear that we have characterized as focused but not factual. In doing so, I believe they should work more closely, or we should work more closely with the neurosciences on an interdisciplinary basis. One important key to the experience of anxiety culture in a post-truth society seems to lie in brain studies, which can explain to us the widespread irrational handling of fears, which seem to lose their rational justification, although possible, due to an unbalanced information processing of our brain. However, there is a momentous note here as well. Brain studies itself is a difficult field in the truest sense of the word, quickly overwhelming many scientists from other disciplines and interested laypeople. Hardly anyone has really read and understood the 500-plus page book entitled Anxious, the Modern Mind in the Age of Anxiety by Joseph Ledoux, published in 2015. In this book, the author undertakes neuroscientific analysis of fear, characterizing it as a fundamental principle of our social behavior and assigning it an essential function in human evolutionary development. On the other hand, simplistic advice on overcoming fear, which comes in the guise of neuroscientific analysis, quickly builds on these fundamental insights into fear. In the social classification of the problem, we often witness a relapse into the pragmatism of the late 20th century, which presents the risks of our time as controllable and attributes the actual problem to a form of wrong because too negative thinking. There are scientifically based guides, such as those written with some success in Germany in recent years by the media psychologist Maren Urner, which tie in with the postulate that our world is statistically too badly talked about and that only the bad news has a chance of being disseminated in the media. The now deceased Swedish physician Hans Rosling, at the time a TED star and influential public intellectual, caused quite a stir along these lines with a 2018 publication. Its title is Factfulness: 10 Reasons We Are Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. Both Rosling and Urner, like many other admonishers, invoke the working of our brains when they call for a more positive media and public approach to facts in our world historical situation. In doing so, however, they fail to sustainably contain the spread of the new form of fear we have identified. The mere fact that their message is to make clear that facts can be used to deceive and defraud is not likely to snap people out of the traumas of a post-truth society. Rather, one must assume that the general insecurity will increase even more when one sees that, depending on the political and economic interests of the individual or the group, the conditions in which we live can be manipulated by facts to be better or worse. So the first thing is not to call to consciousness this relativization of facts, which many of us have known for a long time, but to explain the form of fear that we all face and to make it more visible, a focused fear that manifests itself in public discourses on several levels, but that remains diffuse for many people because in their psyche, the feeling of fear is not adequately connected with the correlating facts. Thank you so much for your attention.